I'd like to thank you for being here this evening, because this was an extraordinary journey for Sue and Julian, and particularly for Sue, who, as we know, served in Royal Navy nursing during the Falklands War and then also in Afghanistan. And I was aware of the journey that Sue was going to make. We discussed and talked about it, and I was intrigued, and I thought it was an incredible thing to do, to go together to the Argentine with representatives of the armed services, meet with Argentinians, including those who had fought in the Falklands War, and to hold an act of reconciliation. And I'm a big admirer of Sue in many, many ways, from her singing in the choir to, as I've often said to you, Sue, thank you for your service. And I'll hand over to you and Julia now, because we are just waiting with bated breath to hear your expedition to Argentina.
Good evening, everyone. I was going to mention that there's a diary at the back. There is a diary at the back of the collection, but I think most of you have copies of it by now. Welcome. The title of our talk is After 40 Years. 40 years has always been a symbolic period. Maybe it's time for healing and moving on. But in January 2022, Sue was invited to be part of the United Kingdom delegation to Argentina in connection to the 40th anniversary of the Falklands conflict. The aim of the delegation was reconciliation, healing, and the promotion of peace, and we were to meet with British and Argentine veterans. It was the first formal United Kingdom delegation to Argentina. There had been some formal and more informal contacts before that, starting with Rick Jolly, a surgeon, I think in the Royal Marines, who served there and visited Argentina in the late 1990s to seek out Argentine patients and the survivors who he had treated and to promote reconciliation. So the Falklands conflict was 1982, diplomatic relations were resumed in 1990, the Prince of Wales visited there in 1999. There are various informal reunions or meetings between veterans from both sides. Some of these can be viewed on YouTube. And one Palarols, who we will feature later in the narrative, Argentine silversmith, had created a rose in memory of Princess Diana. There are also references from the talk which we can provide if you're interested. And there's coffee, tea, and Malbec wine from Argentina, so we're giving some local resonance to the talk. Julian, that's me, will first contextualize a historic situation insofar as it can be understood, and Sue will talk more directly about the trip and conclude with Dorothy Hunt's poem about peace. Let us remember the humanitarian purpose of the visit as we review the historical situation. And today is Maundy, or Holy Thursday. Maundy is a derivative from mandatum, or commandment. A new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another. The next slide, to use slightly old-fashioned terminology, reveals the position of the Falkland Islands in relation, Falkland Islands, or Malvinas as they're also known, in relation to Argentina, and implicitly reveals their distance from the United Kingdom, because we're familiar with the distance of Argentina from the United Kingdom. The Falkland Islands, which you can see towards the bottom of the slide, are some 480 kilometers from the nearest Argentine coast, and deep in the South Atlantic, one of the most inhospitable seas in the world. Flights from Buenos Aires do not currently exist, but it would be about 4 hours flight from Buenos Aires to the Malvinas. Sue had to view a map in 1982 to determine the location of the Falklands. Montevideo, to where Sue flew and then sailed on HMS Hecla to the Falklands, is in Uruguay, opposite Buenos Aires, at a considerable distance by European standards. What we might refer to as the River Plate is probably better understood as the estuary of the River Plate. It's an extensive waterway. Curiously, the debate about sovereignty has not explicitly appealed to geographical proximity, although it's clearly a factor underlying it. Our first view of Buenos Aires and the River Plate estuary was from the plane. It's impressive and revealing. And then we move to the next slide. I suppose I could start with the general, go to the particular, and then come back. We can see the location of the Falkland Islands in relation to South America and to the world as a whole on that projection. In the expansion of the little box, you can see the Falkland or Malvinas just off the southern tip of South America, and the South Georgia Island and the South Sandwich Islands outlined in red further east in the Atlantic. The governor of the Falklands will also act as commissioner to South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands, but there's a complexity and hidden difference here. The governor of the Falklands acts as commissioner, I think, out of administrative convenience. From an Argentine perspective, they'd be regarded as a single political territory. And South Georgia, which is the left hand of those two other islands, was subject to some active dispute before the invasion of the Falkland Islands themselves. There we have a representation of the Falkland Islands. And there are some points about the extent of the landmass, which we'll come on to. The Falklands conflict, war was never formally declared, took place over 74 days, beginning in April 1982. Precise count of days might differ according to whose perspective you take. Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands on the 1st of April 1982 after some civilian scrap metal workers arrived at South Georgia on 19th of March 1982. They were later revealed to be Marines posing as civilian scientists, and raised the Argentine flag. After the invasion of the Falkland Islands themselves, the United Kingdom gathered a task force and to sail there, which would be a journey of some 3 weeks. The task force consisted of 120 ships, military and civilian, and about 30,000 people, including 40 women nurses. I think one of the first women nurses to go to sea and serve in conflict. So, since Korea. The United Kingdom regained Port Stanley in control of the Falklands 74 days later. Final deaths are given as 642 Argentine military, 255 United Kingdom, and 3 civilian islands. There are also subsequently high suicide rates and illness after the conflict. The Falkland Islands themselves, which you can see in that overhead, are windy and wet, with hills rising to about 2,300 feet. There's a mixture of English and Spanish derived names for places. So you've got Mount Carlos and Port Stanley. The current population is around 3,000. It would have been less at that time. That population figure excludes the military personnel stationed there at RAF Mount Pleasant, which would amount to 1,000 or 2,000. Then also schools at Mount Pleasant. What I didn't realise, but one of the people we met mentioned, is that landmass is broadly equivalent to the landmass of Wales. So we may refer to them as islands, but don't think of them as little islands. Under the present constitutional arrangements, the Falklands are a self-governing British overseas territory. The governor will become Alison Blake, a highly experienced diplomat, in July 2022 of this year. You can reconstruct a timeline of the European occupation or settlement of the European and South American occupation or settlement of the Falklands. It's subject to different interpretations. Argentina came into existence in 1810. The years 1832 to 1834 seem particularly complex and problematic for what we call the Falkland Islands. There was certainly an Argentine military force there which rebelled against its captain, and then Britain re-established control of the islands and installed the first British resident. From the 1840s onwards, we seem to get more permanent immigrants from Scotland. The Falklands paper, Penguin News, have recently referred to what they call an expulsion myth or false belief that there was a settled Argentine population expelled between 1832 and 1834. Charles Darwin visited it twice around that period, so they're historical bases for competing claims to sovereignty. The United Nations resolutions emphasize the cherished aim of bringing an end everywhere to colonialism. As we read these resolutions, they don't precisely decide the issue of sovereignty. They urge towards a peaceful and negotiated settlement on sovereignty. And the two parties refrain from taking decisions that would imply introducing unilateral modifications. There were negotiations and practical developments 1965 to 1979. With a change in government in 1979, there was a less persuasive diplomat or relations with the Falklands and Argentine. And then there was a war or conflict in 1982 and a pause in negotiations for the past 40 years. There's some indications of a possible revival because we've noticed articles published in the Guardian newspaper, one by the Foreign Minister of Argentine, one by Simon Jenkins. These are kind of preliminary signs you get that there might be some further movement on these issues. So there's an unresolved issue of sovereignty. Both constitutions of the Falkland Islands, presumably fashioned under United Kingdom jurisdiction, and the 1994 amendment to the Argentine constitution appeal to the United Nations for the realization of the right of self-determination be promoted and respected in conformity to the provision of the Charter of the United Nations. That's the Falkland Islands asking for their, implicitly Falkland Islanders asking for their rights to self-determination. The Argentine nation asserts sovereignty over the Malvinas, Georgios del Sur and Sandwich del Sur Islands. The recovery of these territories, respecting the way of life for its inhabitants and according to the principles of international law, is the permanent goal of the Argentine people. So both appeal to the United Nations resolutions. At the time of the Falklands conflict, Argentina was governed by what we would call a military junta, which had a very poor record on human rights. Talking to people there, family members didn't know whether their relatives disappeared as part of disappeared by the military junta or in the Falklands conflict. And the leader of the delegation was trying to use genetic information to identify the remains of unknown soldiers and reassure or bring closure for families there. The Argentina has been an elective democracy since 1982. There's an ongoing dispute concerning the Darwin cemetery of the Argentine fallen in the Malvinas as to whether they should be exhumed or repatriated. So we've established the historical context insofar as it can be established. We can now move on to the humanitarian, not directly political, purpose of the delegation.
Identify the Argentinian soldiers that had fallen, and that was quite a job, but it has worked very well, and many families, we're pleased to say, are now reunited with their boys. And this year, we're pleased to say, from the visit, there is going to be another exhuming later this year for those families that still would like their loved ones returned to them. So yes, it was quite a time, to be walking into this situation in Argentina, that would we be welcomed, or are we going to receive a bit of a cold shoulder treatment? But in fact, we were very warmly received. And I really loved this little sign that we saw. It just simply said, the measure of love is when you love without measure. And the hospitality we received was just exceptional. Now, as Julian has shared, the sovereignty. Now, sovereignty is an interesting word. I tend to like to look at it as meaning you have that opportunity to explore, to be together, an opportunity to have control and choice. And for the Argentinian people, this is very dear to their hearts. And when we were at one of the bookshops, you will see that there are loads of books about the Malvinas, and also still some graffiti around that the Malvinas, we will return, we will reclaim them back. And that is particularly from the Peronist movement. But it's really just this ongoing debate as to who really has this sovereignty of the Malvinas Falklands. Now, while we were there, we had it was supposed to be 2 days of commemoration, but it ended up being a lot more harder work. Now, when we went to the British Embassy, we first of all went along to a cocktail party and met up with some Argentine veterans, and one of them particularly touched me. We've got a picture of him here. He was a fighter pilot in 1982. And he said to me, never again will I be a fighter pilot. I am now a helicopter pilot that rescues people, and I like to save life. I was particularly moved by that. And then the other picture you see is a chap called Leticia and Graciela. Leticia was actually the commanding officer of the assault at Mount Harriet. So that again was very, very moving to meet with him. And he was also the one that extended the invitation to me to go to a regimental dinner while I was there. And of course the last picture is while we were there, Julian had his birthday. So the British Embassy gave him a traditional Argentine cake, and of course it had this great big sparkler all over it. Quite moving. Now, part of the commemoration is we went along to the Anglican cathedral, because in Buenos Aires there is a huge British community. And this was an interesting church. It was the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. And again, this was very emotionally moving. As the first picture you'll see is I'm meeting Sylvia, who was a nurse in 1982. We're both 63 years old now. And basically, we were working on hospital ships, only we never met. We only met for the first time, which was at this commemoration service. And it was just so moving to just share experiences. Then they were very, very similar. Working on a ship is not easy, particularly when you're nursing casualties. The ship rolls, it moves around. The winds in the Falklands are extremely volatile. So we did a lot of corkscrewing. So we were able to share how we had to protect and find ways to work and keep our casualties comfortable. And the last picture you'll see is of a friend of mine called Sharkey Ward. He's still a Chief Petty Officer in the Royal Navy, one of the oldest serving members. And he, in 1982, was on the hospital ambulance ship, HMS Herald. So he was responsible for helping in the taking of casualties back to Montevideo before they had their long journey home. So again, it was very, very emotional to meet him and to be reunited again after all these years. Now, after the church service, we went along to the Granaderos Regiment, which again is the first time an invitation has been extended to British veterans. So that was quite heartfelt. And we were welcomed with this military band and then shown around the barracks and taken into the officers' mess for lunch. It was just very, very touching. And while we were there, they asked me about the hospital ship Uganda. Well, where I worked in 1982 was in the hull of the ship, right down there at the bottom. So I didn't actually see much of what was going on as such, only a porthole to look out of, and very often the sea would be coming up to it and over it. But it was just amazing to just share that time. And friends from the Falkland Islands, who I'm still in touch with today, just affectionately can remember seeing this white ship with its red crosses lit up like a Christmas tree. Now, as the time went on, in the evening we were treated in Luján to a traditional evening meal, which was, in Argentina they love barbecues, and certainly these people got together and they had prepared us a barbecue, and they were telling us they started at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and we're not eating till 9, so it took a long, long time to cook all this meat. So it was very, very touching. And the gauchos, their horsemanship, again, is very touching, how they build relationships with their horses, and the work that they do is just very, very impressive. And of course, it wouldn't be Argentina if we didn't have the tango. Now, this was just amazing. Now, originally, the tango was danced by 2 men. But it was then felt it needed to be more sensuous and more kind of sexy. In fact, it has been said it's like making love with your clothes on. And so we were given this lovely time of watching these tango dancers. And again, the religious side of Argentina didn't like the fact that it was so sensuous, so the actual tango went across to Paris, where of course it was very well received. And then, of course, Argentina snatched it back, and it really is part of their national identity today. And again, now they will also, 2 women or 2 men can also dance it in Argentina. Now, the next day was perhaps the most emotional. We were invited to a special forces military base to share in a commemoration ceremony. I was given the responsibility to do a small speech while I was there, and to really reflect it on peace and reconciliation. And I also was joined, as you will see by the picture, by a general who I didn't realise was a general at the time, from 1982, Sergio, and we laid our white flowers at the Commemoration Memorial. And that's an interesting memorial because, as you will see on the next picture, it's actually dedicated to the person who was there first lost, and it was actually from the Belgrano, the captain. So that was very, very emotional. And Sharkey laid the wreath that was given to him from the Royal British Legion. So this was a very, very emotional moment for us to share in Argentina. And the last part of our commemoration was to share in a mass for peace. And we were welcomed, as you can see, by this guard of honor. And the statue of St. Mary was actually rededicated back to the cathedral, which had meant a lot to the soldiers in 1982. That was, again, very, very touching. And while we were there, we lit the candle of peace together, and it was so heartfelt from everybody. It was very, very touching. Then I was asked and invited, had the honor to go to the British hospital in Argentina and meet with the staff there, which was again very, very touching, and again to share experiences from what they found from nursing casualties in 1982 to what the British side found. And again, I met up with another Argentine nurse, and here is a picture of the Argentine, well, one of the Argentine hospital ships. And then, of course, I mentioned I was then given this invite from Larticio, who was part of the Mount Harriet offensive from Argentina, to go to a regimental dinner, which again was a very, very moving experience. As the chap who I've got my hand on his shoulder is Mario. He was one of the casualties on the Uganda. And he told me quite fondly how he liked liked the nurse with the big boobies, which I thought was, oh dear, yes, that was quite amusing. And also you have got a picture there of Colonel Cardoza, and the last picture is myself with another doctor who was serving in in Mount Venus in 1982. And of course, it couldn't go to Argentina without seeing the Plaza del Mayo, where Eva Perón stood on that balcony. And again, that was quite a moving time. I mean, I must admit, we were there at 1:15 in the morning. This is after the regimental dinner, so you can imagine what state we're all in. But I just thought that was so moving, just so very moving. And then a complete surprise to me. We were contacted by Juan Peroles, who is this beautiful silversmith in Argentina, very well known, very famous. And he runs something called the Rose of Peace. And he makes these roses himself from bullets and shrapnel from the Malvinas. And he likes to present them to people who campaign or work for peace. And I was really very honoured that he asked if I would go along to his studio, his home, and be presented with this Rose of Peace. And again, as Julian said earlier, that Her Royal Highness, the Princess of Wales, has a rose made for her in her own honour, which I, again, just so very, very touched. And this Rose of Peace has an organisation to it. And when you receive a Rose of Peace, then you're invited to be part of that. And I have found over this anniversary time, since the 5th of April, it has been quite moving to see their posts. And of course, farewell to Buenos Aires. We had our final last look at the bridge, which, as you will see, the Bridge of Women. It looks very much like the Samuel Beckett Bridge in Dublin. And again, we realised it was actually made by the same architect. So that was, Santiago Carrarati. So that was, again, just very, very moving. And again, our taxi driver, Jose and Emil, took us back to the airport where we said our farewells to Buenos Aires. And I think in just reflecting and bringing this time to a close, it's just to remember the words of peace is this moment without judgment. That is all. The moment in the heart space where everything that is welcome. Thank you.
Would anyone like to ask a question of Julian or Sue? was interested in the UN resolution and the follow Argentine suggested because I was quite involved in Central America, not down south, but I worked with people who had gone to the Argentine and had met with mothers who had disappeared and had met with people, well, the mothers had disappeared, you know, something like 34,000 people disappeared. I would be reluctant to sprung from the UPF at that time, and her name is mentioned up there on remembrance plaque. And she was a PhD in the first one, and she spoke German, so therefore she nursed young German soldiers that ended up in British first aid centres. So, you know, so you're following that tradition.
It's so funny because I remember this, you know, I think some Spanish when I was there, but I think that's what brought us through this trip was pidgin English, pidgin Spanish, lots of gesture.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is just, yes, fascinating because all their sort, even though the general Ferdinand was the guy who surrendered to the British in 1982, he was at this reunion and he was interesting. He actually said to me, it's interesting, he said, even though you work under the International Red Cross, he's already said it, you know, you are part of the Royal Navy, or our Argentine nurses were part of the army. So it's very, it is definitely in the International Red Cross, the rule that actually a nurse will nurse food
And is that the same for all armed services throughout the world? And they operate under the umbrella of the
yeah, they are
of the Red
supposed to.
Cross?
They are supposed to, but I know it doesn't always happen.
Yeah.
It doesn't always happen. But yes, it is very much understood because we had something known as the Red Cross clocks or zone that you were allowed to go into to collect your casualties. And that was supposed to be a zone where you were not under attack. But that
Absolutely.
was, did end up under attack. And it's the same in the Green Book, the nurses on the hospital ship did end up under attack. And I know it's set up in slams,
Yeah.
so yeah, it's very much, it's, you know, you like people to work, it doesn't always happen.
Doesn't most certainly does not. Has anybody else stated
Were people from the Falkland Islands invited to these events in Granaderos?
And that, yeah, now that's interesting. We actually raised that while we were there, and the answer is no, it weren't. Now this was something, I think, on this occasion, there was a lot of legitimacy going on. And I think what they did is they thought, let's take out a small British contingent of veterans. And if you look at even Luján Basilica, it's again interesting. You know, they chose Colonel Mendoza, who was the one who repatriated.
sorry, so just can everybody hear Sue? Sue, could we turn on the microphone?
Sorry. Yeah, Colonel Cardoza was the guy who was repatriating the lost on the Argentine side, and he does speak fluent Spanish as well, so that was very, very helpful. Then you had James Pollard, who was a commanding officer, Royal Marines, and he was the one that led the assault at Tumbledown, to David Ween, who I mentioned to you, who did the assault from Mount Harriet. Then you had myself as the one token nurse. Now, how I ended up on it was through this Colonel Cardoza writing to the Hospital Uganda ship and asking who would be willing to go. Well, I'm afraid not many of the nurses were. And I just said, look, I would be willing to go, knowing that you're walking into quite a tricky situation. And yes, you're right, the islanders were not invited on this occasion. Yeah, but this is interesting. I actually spoke to Lard, my friend, on the Falkland Islands because I really wanted to at first. I thought, well, goodness me, if I'm down this way south, then it would be nice to go and visit him. But I couldn't get a flight. There's no flights from Buenos Aires down to the Falkland Islands. And at the time, the military had stopped or they had reduced the flights due to COVID. But Lard was actually very supportive towards me. And so were the islanders. They were right behind me in actually taking on this project. And and they sort of felt that there needs to be some kind of bridge or something. But of course, if you look at their Penguin News or the Falklands Association paper, you'll see on their last pages there's always this update from the Foreign Office as to what is going on with the sovereignty of the Falkland Islands. And you can tell they are very, very worried. Because, again, over the last month, for example, the Guardian newspaper, the Argentine foreign minister has published a couple of things. And he did refer to this particular trip and said that for Argentina, yes, it's been a success. And they will, and they've heard that the next of kin want to be repatriated with their boys. But it still leaves this, what about the sovereignty? And what the islanders and what Argentina, it's still very difficult. But I think you're right, David, the next time, I think they are planning another one. And on that, yes, the islanders will be invited, which I think that would be good, really.
You didn't get the impression, Sue, though, and as I said, it was very much an act of reconciliation in the animals, but you wouldn't get the impression, and it seems from your presentation, that we can be reassured that Argentina wouldn't try to use force again.
I think at the moment, Argentina are taking a United Nations vote and way. They're certainly bombarding the United Nations very heavily, and there's all these resolutions that they're putting forward. So they are putting a lot of pressure on the United Nations to actually hear their argument of this historical injustice. Whereas, of course, the islanders are saying our sovereignty is British, and these islands are British. So it's very, very much difficult. I think if they're going, I don't think they would invade right now. I think there's just too much going on within their own economy, within their own sort of communities at this moment. So I think the Falkland Islanders can be assured on that side. But I think the ongoing struggle with the United Nations, there is a lot of pressure on them, a lot of pressure.
My own advice is not worry about the UN, they're incapable of imposing a new resolution.
Until I actually read the UN resolutions myself, I didn't realise what careful guarded language they were written.
Yeah,
I've always felt, Sue, that people who work in the UN, their permanent work is to keep their job.
yes. Yeah, it's funny you should say that, because for the first time, because that was one thing while we were there, the Argentinian veterans wanted to show you like the International Red Cross cards that we all carried in 1982, which means if you're taken prisoner, you are to be treated in accordance to the law, blah, 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 of the Geneva Convention. And that was really interesting, because we saw these UN workers who are going around with these flashy blue passports. And the ones that are higher up have a flashy red passport that they can travel all over the world on. And you just think, yeah, it's interesting.